Welcome to the Practical NLP podcast with me, Andy Smith. Catch up on previous episodes at nlppod.com. Since we've mentioned reframing, let's talk about it. It's the process of placing events, things, or qualities in a different frame so the person sees them differently. This is important because, as we know from previous episodes on mental maps and filters, we respond not to things as they happen, but to our internal representations of them. As Shakespeare said in Hamlet, there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. 1500 years before that, the philosopher Epictetus said that people are disturbed not by things, but by the view which they take of them. So, if you reframe the meaning of something or the context in which a person has placed it, you change their emotional response and probably their behavioural response to it. In his introduction to Bandler and Grinder's book Reframing, highly recommended by the way, Steve Andreas recounts an old Chinese Taoist tale of a farmer who had a horse. By the standards of his village, this made him a rich man. One day the horse ran away. All the neighbours said, "That's terrible," but all the farmer said was, "Maybe." A few days later, the horse comes back, with 2 wild horses following along. The villagers say, "This is great, you're so lucky," but the farmer only says, "Maybe." Then the farmer's son breaks his leg while he's trying to ride one of the wild horses. The neighbours lament his bad fortune, but the farmer just says, "Maybe." Then the emperor's recruiting sergeants come to the village and take all the young men for the army, except for the farmer's son, who they leave because he has a broken leg. All the neighbours again remark on his good fortune, but the farmer just says, well, I think you can guess what he says. The villagers interpret each event in terms of its immediate circumstances, forgetting how quickly those circumstances can change the frame. They judged the broken leg as bad when they looked at it in terms of helping to get the harvest in. When the draft officers turn up, the broken leg suddenly looks like a stroke of luck. The farmer suspends his judgment, and so doesn't get caught up in the emotional ups and downs of the other villagers, and starts to get a reputation for being very wise. Bandler and Grinder identified 2 basic types of reframe. The context reframe, in which you change the meaning of something by putting it in a different context, and the meaning reframe, where you open up different meanings that an event could have. In coaching or communication generally, you could use these to influence the mindset that comes up with 2 different kinds of complaint. One kind of complaint goes, "I'm too X," or "she's too Y," where X and Y are qualities that the complainer is seeing as bad. The classic example from the book Reframing, and I've yet to come across a better one, so that's the one I'm going to use, is when Virginia Satir was working with a family where the father was a very stuffy president of a bank, who was the dominant one in the marriage. The mother pretty much acted like a doormat, a placater in Virginia's terminology, and the daughter always sided with her mother, but her personality was much more like her father. The father's repeated complaint was that the teenage daughter was too stubborn. So Virginia looked at him and said, "You're a successful man, aren't you?" "Yes," he says. "So was this success just handed to you on a plate? Did your father own the bank?" "No, I worked my way up from the bottom of the ladder." "So you've got to have some tenacity, haven't you? In the course of your career, you've sometimes had to turn people down, when they've wanted loans, for example, because you knew that if you didn't, there'd be bad consequences later on." "Yes, you can't just hand out loans because somebody begs you for one. You've got to stand up for yourself." "And isn't it great," said Virginia, "that you've taught your daughter that same ability to stand up for herself? It's a priceless gift. Imagine how valuable that ability to say no will be to her in a couple of years' time if she finds herself out on a date with a man with bad intentions." So what was Virginia doing there? She was placing the behavior or quality that the father was complaining about, his daughter's stubbornness, in a different context where it looks like a priceless gift rather than a problem. It was important to the father that his daughter should respect and obey him, but it was even more important that his daughter should be protected from harm. The reason this reframe worked so well is that Virginia found a context that appealed to his values, in other words, was emotionally charged for him, at least as much, if not more, than the original problem. That's why the reframe was powerful enough to get him to see his daughter's stubbornness in a new light. The other type of complaint is of the form, "Whenever X happens, I respond Y," where Y is an unwanted emotional response that happens because of the meaning that the person is ascribing to the event X. And a classic example of this, again from the book Reframing, did I mention that you should go and read this book, is of a client of Leslie Cameron Bandler's. This woman was a compulsive clean freak. Everything in the house had to be just so. The family could work round everything else except that any time she saw a footprint on her white carpet, not from mud or dirt, just from the pile on the carpet being pushed a different way, she would yell at them and get the vacuum cleaner out. 5 or 7 times a day. It was a real problem for the family, trying to move around the house without treading on the carpet, so they really needed a solution. So Leslie said to this woman, "Close your eyes and see the carpet. And it's completely clean and unmarked. Not a footprint on it anywhere." And a big smile spreads across the woman's face. She's in heaven, a clean carpet at last. And then Leslie says, "And understand that that means you are completely alone, and that your family, who you love, are nowhere around." And her face crumples up. Then Leslie says, "Now put some footprints on the carpet and look at them and realize that that means the people you care about most are living with you." So in this case, the context is exactly the same, the house where she lives. What changes is the meaning of the event. In NLP terms, we could say the complex equivalence changes. The woman had been running a complex equivalence along the lines of, footprints on the carpet mean I'm not doing my housekeeping duties properly, which felt bad for her. Leslie replaced it with, footprints on the carpet mean the people I love are around me, which felt good. The event is no different, but the meaning of it has changed, which changes the emotional response. Again, the reason this worked so well is because it appealed to her values. In this case, probably even the same values which were part of her identity as a good housewife. So, where the complaint is of the form, whenever X happens, I respond Y, you can generate a meaning reframe by asking yourself this question. What else could X mean? Or, what hasn't this person noticed in this context that will bring about a different meaning and change the response? Or simply, how else could I describe the same situation? So that's a meaning reframe, and remember, a context reframe is where you reframe a complaint of I'm too X or he's too Y by switching to a context where that quality or behavior is useful rather than being a problem. If you attend a live NLP training, you'll have an opportunity to practice getting skilled at generating reframes using both of these patterns. There's another type of reframe that I'll just mention separately because it's not part of classic NLP, but still worth listing because it can be very powerful. It's what I call a figure ground reframe. In the psychology of perception, when you look at something, you'll generally be focusing on a part of what you can see, the figure, and paying less attention to everything else which forms the backdrop or ground. The ground gives a context to the figure, but it's the figure that you normally give your attention to. You'll be familiar with a certain kind of optical illusion, like that one of a vase which changes into 2 facing profiles if you look at it a certain way. You make it change by shifting your attention away from the white space of the vase and onto the black background, which then becomes the figure and turns into facing profiles in silhouette. What used to be the figure becomes the ground, and vice versa. The image flips into something different. There's a way of doing this with words too. An example will probably help. In the graphic novel Watchmen by Alan Moore, you may have seen the movie of it if you haven't read the comic book, the masked vigilante known as Rorschach has been betrayed and put in prison. So he's banged up in there with hundreds of criminals who hate him, many of them because it's him that put them in there in the first place. And in the face of the threats and attacks from these hardened killers, he turns to them and says, "None of you understand. I'm not locked in here with you. You're locked in here with me." Just to break that down, if he's locked up with them, the implication is that he, the figure in this case, should be afraid because he's locked up with them, the ground. When he switches referential index, as we call it in NLP, on that statement, the meaning turns into you, the figure now, should be afraid because you're locked up with me. Another example would be John F. Kennedy's speech where he said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Again, he's taking a relationship of being owed something and switching the 2 participants in the relationship, the person and their country, around to make people see the relationship in a new light, or rather to recall an older way of viewing it. Why not give the figure ground reframe a try with any statement that's problematic for you? In a business context, particularly with objection handling, an ounce of preframing is worth a pound of reframing. If you know what the common objections are, you can preframe them out before they're raised. Before they hired us, some clients did say that we aren't as cheap as some other suppliers they've talked to, until they realize the benefits they get from us that aren't available anywhere else. After hearing that, the prospective client will be wanting to investigate what these benefits are, rather than making a generalized objection on price. That's it for this week's podcast. Remember, you can see the show notes for this episode at nlppod.com, and you can download back episodes you may have missed from the online store at webstore.nlppod.com. See you next time.